Throughout history, many names became linked together to the point that one is seldom heard without the other. Lewis and Clark, for example, forever joined as if they were one entity, in reality lived totally separate lives beyond the voyage of discovery which bears their name. Celebrities have been linked together as well, writers, performers, critics, and couples, though their relationships were viewed, or in some cases came to be viewed, as somewhat odd, either in their time or due to its inexorable passage. The first president/vice presidential team in American history, Washington and Adams, were viewed as an odd combination in their day. For example, a New England Yankee, short, rotund, well-versed in political discourse and dispute, and a tall, elegant Virginia gentleman and war hero, well above the political fray. Not all of history's odd couples were involved in personal relationships, yet they are linked to each other by their shared history. Some were of course linked personally, others politically, and still others professionally, as performers, inventors, relatives, or simply as fodder for editors and gossip columnists. At one time they were all well known for their interactions with each other, some more so than others. History shows their relationships to have been, well, somewhat different, notably so at the time and since. Here are some of history's odd couples, from different walks of life. Number 1. Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. Henry VII had been married 3 times already when he became betrothed to Anne of Cleves, destined to become his 4th wife. Technically, Henry was only married 3 times in total, since 3 of his marriages were annulled, a legal term which denies that a marriage took place. One of the annulled marriages was to Anne of Cleves, who was unseen by Henry until shortly before their wedding day. By that time the marriage was a political and diplomatic necessity, though Henry was unimpressed by what he had seen of his new bride. According to all parties involved, the marriage was never consummated, and was annulled after only 6 months. Henry did not have the courtier responsible for the match with Anne executed, as legend reports, and there is some doubt whether he truly said, "But now I like her much worse," after seeing her on their wedding night. After the annulment, Anne remained a member of Henry's court, and actually outlived all of the other of Henry's wives, treated by the king as a close and trusted friend. Their marriage was the shortest of his 6, but she was the last of the fabled 6 wives to die, and probably became the most trusted of all of his marital companions, regardless of the length of their union. Number 2. Adam and Eve. According to the creation story recounted in Genesis, repeated in legend after legend and depicted in art throughout history, Adam and Eve, the mother and father of mankind, would have to be considered an odd couple. They were, after Adam gave up a rib, allowed to live in a paradise never again attained, for the relatively low cost of simply ignoring the fruit of a specific tree. Their failure to comply led to their expulsion from said paradise, and all the woes of humanity which descended from them. That Adam and Eve could not enjoy happiness in the midst of all required for their happiness and upkeep, makes them, besides being the first couple, the oddest couple of them all. Of course, for those who do not take the Bible literally, Adam and Eve, like many of the stories included in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament, is not strictly historical. But even discounting their consumption of forbidden fruit and unleashing the evils of the world, they would qualify as an odd couple, having, according to the story, eaten themselves out of house and home. Number 3. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. History records Marie Antoinette, who besides being the Queen of France was the sister of the Emperor of Austria, leading the ultimate in noble indifference to the plight of her poor and starving subjects. History is unfair. Antoinette was in truth a dedicated worker for the betterment of the French poor, both in the cities and among the rural peasantry. She was though dedicated to her own luxury and comfort, as well as to her several extramarital lovers, and to the entertainment of her court and other nobles at the expense of the peasantry and the French treasury. Her husband, Louis XVI, was on the other hand a man who liked to use his hands, to the point that he operated his own blacksmith shop above the salons where the nobility mingled. Their dedication to each other is evident in the children they had together, though it was Marie's scheming to save the French monarchy which ultimately led to her husband's execution. he was willing to serve as a constitutional monarch. It was she who exhorted him to flee France, which led to his arrest, and finally several months later to her own. Number 4. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Bonnie Parker was married, wearing her husband's wedding ring when she died alongside Clyde Barrow in a fusillade of gunfire. Known to the world as Bonnie and Clyde, the couple became instant legends. They were already mythologized by the press, though a more odd couple would be hard to find. Bonnie was married to a Roy Thornton, in prison at the time of her death, had never been in legal trouble herself before meeting Barrow, though her judgment of men's character was obviously shaky, and was in her own mind at least a poet of talent. Barrow was already a career criminal who had at one time chopped off his own toes to avoid a work detail while in prison. The pair's murder and robbery spree made them famous during the height of the Depression, with some describing them as modern-day Robin Hoods, robbing only the wealthy. In truth, they were murderous thugs. Parker herself, and several biographers and apologists since, wrote of her love for Clyde Barrow, though as noted she was wearing her wedding ring at the time of her death, and though she died alongside Clyde and is forever linked to him, the couple were never married. In fact, many biographers of the latter believed him to have been impotent, making their relationship even more difficult to comprehend. Number 5. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Of the collection of notables collectively linked as the founders, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are the two most identified as the driving force behind the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Adams was one of the earliest and most vocal supporters of permanent separation from Great Britain. Jefferson's pen was what explained the action to posterity. Once close allies, they toured sites in Great Britain, and later New England, together, visiting among other things the home of William Shakespeare, of whose works both were enamored. Jefferson chipped one of the bard's chairs for a souvenir to take home. Adams was a man of simple tastes. Jefferson enjoyed French cuisine, Italian wine, and the theater. Adams was a devout reader of the Bible. Jefferson eventually created his own revision of the New Testament. Eventually they fell out, though years later they reconciled their personal and political differences through a correspondence which remains one of the most informative of American history. Nonetheless, Jefferson once wrote of Adams one of taste, while Adams complained of Jefferson's use of the Declaration of Independence to further his, Jefferson's, reputation. Writing to Benjamin Rush, Jefferson ran away with all the stage effect of that, i.e. all the glory of it. Number 6. James Buchanan and William Rufus King. James Buchanan was an American lawyer and politician of note in the antebellum period. As the United States gradually became more and more disunited over the issue of slavery, Buchanan rose to prominence in the Democratic Party, eventually becoming their candidate for President of the United States in the election of 1856. He won despite long-standing rumors that the unmarried Buchanan, he never married though in his youth he had been engaged for a time, was involved in a relationship with William Rufus King. Rumors of their relationship had permeated Washington society for more than 3 decades prior to Buchanan becoming president. Number 7. Abbott and Lou Costello. Abbott and Costello were one of the most successful comedy teams of their day, appearing in film, on radio, and on stage, and eventually in television. Their classic performance of Who's on First remains one of their most famous, so successful that they often parodied it themselves in subsequent skits and appearances. Their partnership came about as the result of a fortuitous circumstance. Costello's regular vaudeville partner was unable to perform, and became so entrenched in the public mind that Abbott and Costello became an American phrase descriptive of inseparable components, a la bacon and eggs or rain or shine. Both shared some things besides performing. Inveterate gambling for one, and neither was particularly good at it. Their appearances played on their differences, one tall and spare, the other short and pudgy, one straightforward and sensible, the other eager to get rich quick. In truth, they could barely stand each other, did not socialize when not performing together, and neither achieved solo success when they broke up their act in 1957. They made their fortune and reputation by presenting themselves as an odd couple barely tolerant of each other's foibles. In real life they were far less tolerant and eventually suffered for it. Number 8. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. What made the act known as Martin and Lewis one of the most successful in entertainment history was Jerry Lewis's shenanigans, which distracted the audience from Dean Martin's straight man attempts to sing. Martin was handsome, debonair, and a singer almost without peer. Lewis was a bumbling clown, with a voice calculated to start cats howling in protest. As an act they were huge. One of their comedy writers was a very young Norman Lear. They appeared on stage and in films as the ultimate odd couple, and audiences loved them. Martin and Lewis became, besides highly successful entertainers, very close friends. It was not to last. Martin began to tire of the odd couple routine, especially as their films focused more on Lewis and his various shenanigans. Their final film together was appropriately named Hollywood or Bust. Martin went on to a film and recording career of his own, as well as becoming the host of several successful television programs, never again performing with his old partner. Lewis launched a solo career as a comedic actor and performer, though he eventually performed in dramatic roles as well. Their odd couple routine became the highest paid act in America during the 1950s. After they split in 1956, the two did not speak to each other for over 2 decades. Number 9. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Spencer Churchill. Franklin Roosevelt was a social reformer who believed in government intervention in society, the creator of the New Deal, Social Security, government subsidies for farmers, and civil rights for all members of society. Churchill was an imperialist, a lifelong proponent of the British Empire and what Rudyard Kipling described as the white man's burden. Together they became the bulwark which protected the West from Hitler's Nazism and the Japanese adventurism in the Pacific, though their motives were somewhat different. Above all else, Churchill strove to defend, protect, and preserve the British Empire, which had been the focal point of his entire life. Roosevelt was determined to prevent Nazism and communism from infiltrating the Americas, as well as ensuring the defeat of Japanese imperialism. Their odd couple relationship defeated the Nazis and Japanese, but led to the end of the British Empire and the emergence of the Soviet Union as a superpower in the aftermath of the Second World War. Churchill and FDR were very much an odd couple, and over the course of their relationship the British Empire faded away, supplanted as the world's policeman by the United States of America. Number 10. Alfred Hitchcock and Alma Reville. It would not be remiss to refer to Alfred Hitchcock as odd, simply based on several of the man's quirks. He was a practical joker of legendary and often borderline cruel dimensions. Hitch enjoyed telling jokes while in elevators, for example, though sometimes he would tell a particularly risque story about some famous actor or actress. He would time the story so that the elevator doors opened just as he was about to reveal the punchline or the name of the celebrity featured in his salacious tale, leaving behind a car full of frustrated listeners. Hitchcock was flamboyant and vain, ensuring his appearance in all of his movies, and difficult to convince that he was wrong about anything. Number 11. Donatien Alphonse Francois and Renee-Pelagie Cordier. Donatien Alphonse Francois is better known by his inherited title, that of the Count de Sade, though his forebears had taken to using the title Marquis in lieu of Conde by the time of his birth in 1740. De Sade was a writer and philosopher, as well as a politician, whose licentious behavior and prose led to his titular name being the root of the word sadism. He carried his beliefs expressed in his work into his personal life, his wife, Renee-Pelagie Cordier, becoming, according to his political enemies, his procurer, in company with his mother-in-law, of prostitutes and eventually other young women and girls. Number 12. Al Gore Jr. and Tommy Lee Jones. Tommy Lee Jones is an actor of distinction, having played diverse roles in film and television, including his breakout role in the afternoon soap opera One Life to Live. A graduate of Harvard University, where he played football on the undefeated 1968 team. Jones is a Texan by birth and by choice, residing there when not working. He is an avid fan and player of polo, as well as a fan of the NBA's San Antonio Spurs. He is also one of two men whom author Eric Siegel used as the basis for the character Oliver in his novel Love Story, later made into a film starring Ryan O'Neal. The other man Siegel used was Jones's roommate at Harvard, Gore Jr. Number 13. T.S. Eliot and Groucho Marx. T.S. Eliot was the descendant of one of Boston's Brahmin families, though born in St. Louis, Missouri, and became a famed American poet, essayist, critic, publisher, and commenter on social mores and behavior. In his 30s he renounced his American citizenship, becoming a subject of the King of Great Britain. Late in life, he wrote a fan letter to a man whose public persona was very much different from his own. Groucho Marx was known as a zany comedian, with an irreverent and biting wit, the product of New York's rougher neighborhoods and the hard life of a vaudevillian before he found success in motion pictures and eventually television. Eliot requested a photograph of Groucho, and the comedian complied, launching a friendship which lasted for the remainder of Eliot's life. The friendship was one of the pen, rapidly becoming a lost art in the electronic world, and though the two could not have been more different in temperament, reflected in the tension in their letters, they developed a deep respect for each other. The once anti-Semitic Eliot and the Jewish Groucho skirted around their obvious differences, though with pointed observations about the tension each so obviously felt. Groucho, being Groucho, was never above a barb directed at the well-born poet, including once writing in a letter to the twice-married and noted philanderer, Eliot, "My best to you and your lovely wife, whoever she may be." Number 14. Wilbur Wright and Orville Wright. The Wright brothers, William and Orville, were an odd couple in many ways. Wilbur was the elder of the pair, by 4 years. They were the sons of a Protestant bishop, both named for local clergymen respected by their father. As boys both played with kites, toy gyrocopters, and bicycles. Neither graduated from high school, though both attended for a time. Neither ever married, nor is there evidence in the historical record of either ever seriously considering marriage. After achieving fame and wealth through their innovations in aviation, they built a large and impressive home in Dayton, Ohio, where it was planned that both brothers would reside, with their sister Catherine as the woman of the house. Wilbur died of typhoid before the house, which was named Hawthorne Hill and which still stands in the Dayton suburb of Oakwood, was completed. Orville and Catherine resided there until 1926, when Catherine married, enraging her brother. Harboring feelings of betrayal and abandonment, Orville refused to either receive or visit his sister until just before her death in 1929. Orville Wright, the man who first flew a powered heavier-than-air aircraft, lived to see supersonic flight achieved before he died in 1948. The brothers are buried side by side in Woodlawn Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. Number 15. Danny Simon and Roy Gerber. Danny Simon was the older brother of playwright Neil Simon, and a comedy writer for radio and television. With his younger brother he wrote scripts for comedy stars in the early days of television, including Jackie Gleason, Milton Berle, Sid Caesar, and Phil Silvers. In the early 1960s Danny and his wife separated, later to divorce, and Danny took rooms with another Hollywood personality, agent Roy Gerber. When the two invited friends over for dinner, one of them, the story claims it was Danny, burned the pot roast. Danny decided to use the story and subsequent events as the basis for a play. Danny later gave the unfinished script to younger brother Neil, who finished it in 1965 and presented it as The Odd Couple. It later spawned a film and television series of the same name, as well as numerous onstage revivals and adaptations. Danny and Roy are largely unknown today, but they were the inspiration for Felix Unger and Oscar Madison, though other stories of their genesis have emerged to conflict with the one based on Danny, and confirmed by Neil Simon in interviews since. Danny's subsequent omission from the credits for the play and film caused a rift between the brothers which lasted for over a decade. Number 16. Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini. Englishman Arthur Conan Doyle created one of the great odd couple arrangements, albeit a fictional one, in his writings of the domestic arrangements between his characters Dr. John Watson and Sherlock Holmes. Watson was continuously bemused by his roommate's chemical experiments, his fondness for strong shag tobacco and the unorthodox manner in which he stored it, and his predilection for the use of cocaine, as well as his unusual hours, playing of the violin, and other eccentricities. In real life, Doyle was a spiritualist, a believer in the afterlife and communications with the spirit world through mediums. His friend Harry Houdini was also interested in the afterlife, though from the aspect of debunking fraudulent spiritualists. Number 17. Samuel Clemens and Nikola Tesla. Samuel Tesla had acquired his pen name Mark Twain, and an abiding interest in technology and science from his days as a riverboat pilot. Nikola Tesla had survived a youthful illness, passing the time in part by reading the books produced by Mark Twain. The pair met in the 1890s, and Twain became a frequent visitor to the eccentric Tesla's New York laboratories. Twain's initial interest had been in investing in Tesla's inventions, including in a typesetting machine through which the author suffered significant losses. Despite the financial setback, Twain was fascinated with the inventor and the machinery he produced. Twain was not a writer of science fiction, nor science-oriented tales, though he did create a story which featured the idea of traveling back in time, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. The two men remained friends for many years, though Tesla developed a reputation of leaving the bills unpaid at hotels in which he resided when he was finally asked to remove himself. Unknown benefactors covered his debts, Twain most likely among them, allowing the scientist to continue to polish his reputation as one of America's oddest residents. They remained close friends until Twain's death. Number 18. Don Everly and Phil Everly. Like the Wrights, the Everlys were brothers, and like the aviation pioneers, their life's work is forever entwined with each other. The Everly brothers were one of pop music's seminal acts. They were still in their teens when they became international stars. Don was 19, younger brother Phil 17 years of age. Their musical career was based on harmony, the tight vocal pairings the brothers achieved in recordings and reproduced live on stage. But the harmony was limited to their music. Don and Phil Everly spent most of their career as performers together, loathing each other. Phil once tried to make light of their mutual contempt by referring to their only having one argument, though it had lasted for 25 years. In 1973, a performance was interrupted by an onstage argument, triggered by Don's having shown up to the performance drunk. After a 10-year hiatus from each other, they reunited in 1984 only to find that they still couldn't stand each other, refusing to appear at promotional events and interviews together. Phil Everly died in 2014. 2 years later, Don Everly told an interviewer that he kept some of his brother's ashes in his home, habitually bidding them good morning whenever he was there. Number 19. Zsa Zsa Gabor and Felipe de Alba. Zsa Zsa Gabor loved being married, or at least she loved weddings, since she took the vows of that blessed state no less than 9 times during her lifetime. Next to last in her line of husbands was Felipe de Alba, an attorney and sometime actor, having appeared in small roles in lesser-known films of the 1940s and 1950s. He was not the only actor to have wed Zsa Zsa. George Sanders filled the role of her husband from 1949 to 1950, but it was clear that her preference of a career in marriageable men was one who had a great deal of money. Conrad Hilton, hotel magnate and Gabor husband for 5 years, is but one such example. Gossip writers were surprised by Zsa Zsa's marriage to Felipe in 1983, but they did not have very long to express it. The couple were married on April 13, a Wednesday. Later that same day, it was revealed that her preceding marriage, to Michael O'Hara, had not been legally ended. Hence her marriage to Alba was illegal, and the following day, April 14, It was annulled. Alma moved to New York, having decided, evidently, that marriage to Zsa Zsa was a little too odd for his tastes. The couple did not continue their relationship, and Alma had the distinction of being married to Zsa Zsa for the shortest time of any of her husbands, indeed of being in one of the shortest-lived marriages in history, less than 24 hours. Number 20. Walt Disney and Pamela Lyndon Travers. When Walt Disney promised his young daughters that he would make their favorite character, Mary Poppins, into a motion picture, he gave himself a project which would take 2 decades for him to complete. The creator of the character, P. L. Travers, née Helen Lyndon Goff, opposed the Disney version of her books far more stridently than is depicted in the 2013 film Saving Mr. Banks. The portrayal of Disney in the film was largely fictionalized as well. Walt Disney was far less happy-go-lucky than the portrayal by Tom Hanks, and his company's treatment of the author less accommodating. Travers later said of the Disney version of Mary Poppins, "I learned to live with it." The unlikely pairing of Disney and Travers produced the classic 1964 film, but it was many years before the franchise could be built upon, in large part because of Travers' continuing opposition. In her last will and testament she specified what could and could not be done with her work in future adaptations, specifically excluding the Sherman Brothers, who had written the songs for the Disney film, from providing new songs in future adaptations of her work. Despite the strange pairing of Walt Disney and P.L. Travers, the odd couple produced one of the most enduring children's films of the 1960s, which 50 years later threatens to expand into a film franchise, long after the deaths of Disney and Travers.